While the marshals of the army were trying to understand what was happening and what Lusheng was doing here, our boy gently descended to the ground in front of them. Everyone began to observe him in silence without saying a single word. Lusheng turned towards them and his eyes began to shine with tranquility. With a cheerful tone, he asked if he could return to the Dragon Kingdom with them later. Our boy started walking towards them. The eyes of the marshal of the central district widened in surprise and his attention fixed on Lusheng. He couldn't help but sweat and with a trembling voice, he said that of course. The marshal's eyes began to shine with joy and a smile spread across his face. They had been begging for 200 years without obtaining anything and it turned out that the heavens had been preparing a great surprise for them. Lusheng was the wonder of the human world. They had won the lottery and finally, after so much suffering, it was time to enjoy the sweetness. He took out his mobile phone, closed his eyes and with a smile, he began to point at it with his finger, asking Lusheng to communicate with them. While they were conversing, someone wearing tattered clothes began walking toward them, catching Lusheng's attention. Upon hearing the voice, Lusheng's eyes widened with curiosity, making him turn around. The battlefield was filled with the corpses of warriors and martial saints who had dared to face Lusheng. Cumberland, who was injured, began to approach our boy. He placed his hand on his chest and, with a serious gaze, acknowledged that Lusheng had great potential but explained that if he took all the energy crystals, a great disaster would befall him and even the entire planet could face destruction. He clenched his fist and asked our boy to think carefully about it. Instead of feeling fear, Lusheng's eyes filled with excitement. He turned toward Cumberland and, with a confident expression, revealed that his plan was to make the guide come looking for him, asking them not to worry since he was not going to involve anyone else. After saying this, Lusheng turned his back and began to converse with the marshals. Upon hearing what Lusheng planned to do, Cumberland's eyes filled with fear and his jaw dropped in surprise. According to him, Lusheng was a lunatic. His attention was fixed on Lusheng. He was speechless and, little by little, fear began to take control of his body. Many questions came to his mind. He did not know what Lusheng had planned to do or whether he intended to face the guides. Lusheng met with the marshals, and while the giant energy crystal was shining intensely, the powerful martial saints of the Island of 1,000 Saints approached the area. Everyone's gaze was fixed on Lusheng. They all watched in silence as Lusheng departed as if they were witnessing a true god. With a lost gaze, Lusheng began to observe the energy crystal in silence and sank into his thoughts. The greatness he had achieved at this moment was an unprecedented accomplishment in history. In the future, no one knew if anyone else would be able to surpass Lusheng. Several hours later, it began to get dark, and Lusheng arrived at the island's airport. A fighter jet descended, and our boy started walking toward it. While he was distracted, someone shouted his name. Upon hearing this, Lusheng's eyes widened with curiosity. He stopped walking and turned around. It was Fiona. With her eyes full of love and sadness, she placed her hands on her chest and began to contemplate our boy in silence. Seeing that it was Fiona, Lusheng turned his back on her and started walking toward the fighter jet. Fiona approached Lusheng, began looking at the ground, and with a curious and nervous expression, mentioned that he had not told her what his real name was. Lusheng turned his head, and while his eyes were shining with confidence, he began to observe her, and with a smile said that his name was not important, asking her to forget about him. He got into the helicopter and revealed that he already had a fiancée. Fiona placed her hands on her chest and remained silent, not knowing what to do. Once Lusheng got on the helicopter, it took off and began to soar through the sky. The poor Fiona had no choice but to lift her head and watch as Lusheng left in silence, unable to do anything about it. Her eyes filled with sadness and tears, she began to cry, knowing that she would not find someone as strong and handsome as Lusheng. Just then, Cumberland appeared, placed his hand on her shoulder, and with a serious gaze mentioned that Lusheng was right, asking her to forget about him since Lusheng and she were not destined to be together. She grabbed her arm and began to gaze toward the ground, sunk in her thoughts. She started staring intently at Lusheng's helicopter, and her eyes began to shine with confidence and determination. She knew what she had to do now. Without wasting another second, she removed her father's hand from her shoulder, turned her back on him, and started walking away, Cumberland's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. He reached out his hand and tried to stop his daughter, not knowing what she was planning to do. The martial saints who had been beaten by Lusheng appeared. The one wearing glasses extended his hands, and with a sad expression, informed Cumberland that Lusheng had taken all the energy crystals and asked what they should do now. The other martial saint, who had a bump on his head, began to show a forced smile. Upon hearing their voice, Cumberland's attention fixed on them. He turned around, and with a serene gaze, began to ponder in silence. His eyes filled with rage, and with a furious gaze, he made it clear that there was nothing left to do. Now they could only wait for the arrival of the great guide so that Lusheng, who believed himself to be the pinnacle of humanity, would understand the true price of breaking the rules. He began to imagine the arrival of the guide, a being with 4 eyes, who started staring intently at Lusheng with a furious gaze. Feeling the pressure, Lusheng's eyes filled with fear, throwing him into panic. The eyes of one of the martial saints filled with joy. He clenched his fists and felt happy thinking that the great guide was going to help them teach the arrogant Lusheng a good lesson. The other martial saint beside him became pleased and couldn't help but smile, believing that his friend was right. The man's eyes widened with malice and hope. He began to smile, saying that the guides were supreme and invincible beings, believing they were going to give Lusheng a good beating for breaking the rules. Cumberland extended his hand, and his attention focused on it. His eyes filled with confidence since once the guides arrived, Lusheng was going to die, knowing that no one could escape from the palm of the guides. At the same time, in the eastern military district, there was a large mansion. It was luxurious and had fountains as decoration. Inside the mansion, more precisely, in the kitchen, was Lusheng's family. With a smile, the mother was preparing the dough. The father, who was smoking a cigarette, was also helping to make dumplings, while on the other side, the sister was massaging the mother's shoulders. Just then, Snowy, who was holding a tray with tea, opened the door and entered the kitchen. Her attention fixed on them and her eyes began to shine. With joy upon realizing that they had worked very hard, she entered the kitchen and approached them. Seeing this, the mother's eyes filled with happiness. King clasped her hands, closed her eyes and couldn't help but smile upon seeing that Sister Snowy had arrived. With a kind smile, the father thanked Snowy for bringing tea. King began to stretch her arms and, with a tired expression, told her mother that if they wanted to eat dumplings, they could let a chef make them. She didn't understand why her mother insisted so much on making them herself, explaining that homemade dumplings were not as delicious as those made by chefs. The mother's attention focused on King, and she couldn't help but smile. The father, who was smoking, started observing his daughter and with a smile explained that no matter how skilled a great chef was, the dumplings they made would never have the same taste as those of her mother, revealing that her mother's culinary talent was incomparable. The eyes of King filled with confusion, and instead of arguing, she remained silent. With a smile, the mother explained that it was not as exaggerated as the father said. She thought that it had been a long time since she last cooked, so she wanted to practice her skills. Otherwise, when Lu Shang returned and wanted to eat, if she was out of practice, the food would not taste good. The father crossed his arms and with a confident smile said that he was only telling the truth. They both shared a loving hug. Seeing this, King felt somewhat confused but then thought that Lu Shang was the most important. Her eyes widened with curiosity. She turned to Snowy and with a smile asked her when Lu Shang would return, remembering that more than a year had passed. Snowy placed the tea tray on the table and began observing her in silence, not knowing what to say. The mother clenched her fist and, with a sincere expression, admitted that it had been a long time since they had spoken with Lu Shang. She wanted to know when our boy was going to return. Upon hearing the name Lu Shang, the father's eyes widened with curiosity. Snowy approached the window and, with a sad gaze, began to observe the landscape, not knowing what to say to Lu Shang's family. Seeing her expression, King also became sad. Just then, the phone she carried in the pocket of her skirt started vibrating. She took out the phone and her eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. King's attention was fixed on her. She fell into confusion, without knowing what was happening. Without saying a single word, Snowy turned her back on them, and with a confused expression, opened the door and started running outside. King's gaze and that of the others were fixed on her. They all became confused and felt somewhat worried about her. Snowy left the mansion, and her eyes filled with surprise. King and her mother also stepped out of the mansion. King was paralyzed. With a confused look, the mother asked why Snowy had suddenly run outside. Snowy's eyes began to shine with joy and a tear appeared in them. Lu Shang, who was wearing a marshal's uniform, appeared and with a confident smile announced his arrival. Upon seeing Lu Shang, Snowy did not hesitate for even a second before starting to run toward him. She hugged him tightly and mentioned that she had been waiting for him for a long time. Lu Shang's jacket fell to the ground. He didn't know what to say since all this time she had been working hard taking care of his parents. Lu Shang hugged her and with a joyful smile told his mother and father that he had returned. The father closed his eyes and began to smile. The mother's eyes filled with tears. She felt happy to see that her son had returned. King wiped the tear from her eye with her finger and with a cheerful smile asked why Lu Shang had taken so long to return. Night fell and everyone entered the mansion. Lu Shang and Snowy also helped make dumplings and the family enjoyed a good gathering. The mother was preparing the dough, while on the other side, Lu Shang and the others were making the balls. Lu Shang's eyes began to shine with seriousness. He remained listening to his family's incessant conversations with an expression of firm clarity. Lu Shang, an incomparable sword in this world, knew that his home was his sheath. The mansion's garden was beautiful. After eating, Lu Shang and Snowy went out for a walk in the garden. The moon was shining high in the sky. With a loving gaze, Lu Shang began to look into Snowy's eyes and mentioned that he remembered the time they had met. It had been around this time of year. Snowy approached him and with a loving look nodded her head. Lu Shang hugged her by the waist, explaining that in a few days he was going to take his parents back to Bay, and after resolving some matters, he was going to go to her house. Lu Shang approached her and while blushing mentioned that their matters should also be resolved. Having Lu Shang so close, Snowy couldn't help but blush like a tomato. Under the moonlight, and surrounded by beautiful flowers, Lu Shang and Snowy shared a passionate kiss. In the conference room of the military department, all the marshals and high-ranking officers of the army gathered, and the screen began to show Lu Shang's battle. Everyone clenched their fists and praised Lu Shang for being incredible. The marshal of the Central District put his arms behind his back and with a serene expression, announced that today was destined to be a day remembered by all compatriots of the nation of the dragon. A 200-year-old wish had been fulfilled, and furthermore, they had welcomed the god of the army, who had surpassed and strengthened all the martial saints of the Blue Star. He began to observe the others and explained that besides this great honor, there was another matter. The martial saint, Lu Shang, had entrusted him with the task of promoting body refinement techniques throughout the entire army. Upon hearing this, the eyes of the other marshals widened in surprise and their jaws dropped. They did not know what body refinement technique Martial Saint Lu Shang wanted to promote or what kind of supreme art it was.